Hello and welcome to the 2019-2020 Av Safety Seminar Series. This seminar is entitled Enhancing Pilot Skills, Expect the Unexpected. The reason we've used the title Expect the Unexpected is to hone in on those skills and practices that help us to prevent those unexpected events occurring either prior or during flight, and to think about those human factors that affect us when we're making those decisions. During this seminar, we're going to cover off on three specific areas. Those areas are planning for safety, decision making, and checklists. Now, you may think about, when we're talking about planning for safety, an old adage that you've probably heard several times. Failure to plan? What does that actually mean? It means planning to potentially fail. So the more work that we can actually do on the ground before we actually go flying can actually help us, I suppose, make sure that we have a better flight. Now, if we go back to what our actual responsibilities are under the obligations of the regulations, we think about, what do I need to do as pilot in command? We have to think about where that flight actually starts from and where it actually finishes. So it covers off the start, continuation, diversion, and end of the flight. The safety of those people that we're actually carrying on board our aircraft, and that final authority for that flight and the maintenance of the discipline of all of those passengers on board actually rely, well, I suppose, stay with us as the pilot in command. Now, I've taken snippets of this out of the regulations of 233 and 224. These are only small snippets, but you'll actually find more information on your obligations under those particular regulations. What are our actual obligations in regard to pre-flight planning? Before we actually go flying, we have the responsibility to actually check into quite a few different areas. And those include weather, that's fairly self-explanatory at this point, navigation aids. What navigation aids will I actually use during my flight? Am I actually capable of using the navigation aids that are available? The aerodrome that I'm going to. Is the aerodrome an ALA, for example? Do I need to actually ring the owner to get permission to fly into that aerodrome? What are the conditions like there? What was the last time that someone actually looked at the condition of the runway? Air traffic control. When was the last time that I maybe flew into that type of airspace? Do I actually understand what air traffic control's instructions that they may give me along the way? Fuel calculations, instruments and equipment. Am I actually carrying the correct equipment for my flight? And briefing ourselves with our maps and our charts and our NOTAMs before we go. And these are all requirements that we need to check into underneath our regulations. Now, one thing that we can actually help us out is to run through a bit of a checklist for ourselves. So it's a preparation and planning checklist. And I like to call that checklist the PAVE checklist. So the P in the PAVE stands for pilot. The A stands for the aircraft. V, it's a little bit of an odd one, but V stands for environment, and E standing for our external pressures. So what I'd like to do is actually run through each of those particular elements one by one. The first one that we're going to run through is P for pilot. So what is the expectation on us as the pilot in command before we actually go flying? So things that we need to consider are us as the actual pilot, am I well enough to actually fly? And you may have heard the acronym I'm safe, or looked at one of CASA's pre-flight personal minimums checklist to understand what we need to consider about ourselves. Currency. When was the last time that I actually flew? So outside of my normal 3 takeoffs and landings in the 90 days, have I actually thought about my other currency requirements that I need to consider? It's not just about what the regulations sort of say, but more or less, what am I comfortable with flying as far as currency goes? Those that are more regular up in the air may not be thinking about that currency as much as maybe those people that are leaving it a few months between each particular flight. General competency. So general competency is an interesting one. You may have a single engine requirement or endorsement under your Part 61 licence. But if you go and fly a Cessna 172, that may not necessarily mean that you can go and jump into your Piper Warrior to go for your flight. Those aircraft may have different systems, they may have different speeds that all need to be considered, and whether you're actually competent to be able to manage a different aircraft type. Fatigue. So have I had a decent night's sleep? Medication. Whether that be actually prescribed medication or medication that's received over the counter from the chemist. An illness. How well am I able to be able to fly? As you may be aware, sometimes when we suffer from colds and flus, it can impact on the way we actually think. So let's move on now to the A for aircraft. What other things do we need to consider about the actual physical aircraft that we're getting in to fly? So we might think about airworthiness, our maintenance release, making sure that we've covered off on all the things that we need to review on the maintenance release. Its serviceability. Have I actually conducted my daily pre-flight inspection? And for those of you who actually fly regularly, how often do you maybe go and do a post-flight inspection to make sure that nothing has occurred during flight to our aircraft? Fuel, weight and balance, instrumentation, and we covered off a little bit on instrumentation earlier, and then equipment. Now you may note on the slide there that we've talked about water or designated remote areas, and there's additional requirements that we need to consider when we're flying over those particular regions. Designated remote areas are annotated in IRSA and prescribe certain areas across Australia, such as northwestern parts of Tasmania, the Snowy Mountains region in New South Wales, just to name a few. And our requirements to consider survival equipment when we fly in those particular regions. So you'll see on the screen here a picture of a Malaysian A330 Airbus. Now I know we're all not experts on A380 aircraft, but I'd like to have you just look at this closely for a moment, and this aircraft is preparing itself for pushback. As you'll see that the sky walkway has actually been moved back and that the tow motor is just about to push that aircraft back. If you look below the windscreens of the aircraft, you'll see a couple of little items hanging from the aircraft. And we'll zoom in here, and they're actually the pitot tube covers. Now this happened only just a few years ago in Brisbane. And we might talk about these seminars being predominantly aimed at the GA area, but you'll see here that it's not just the GA pilots that can be making mistakes, it's actually our commercial operators as well. So in this particular circumstance, there'd been evidence of mud wasps creating nests within a very short time frame in Brisbane. The local engineers ended up putting on pitot tube covers to ensure that the mud wasps would not build nests inside the pitot tubes during their turnaround time. Unfortunately, this was not communicated to the engineering crew of the Malaysian aircraft or to the actual flight crew as part of their pre-flight inspection. As a result, the aircraft ended up pushing back and taking off, and obviously pitot tube covers, meaning the fact that there was significant discrepancies in the readings of their instrumentation. The aircraft ended up having to return to Brisbane for an overweight landing. So now we'll move on to the V, meaning environment. So you might need to consider many different aspects of the environment around you. During December of 2019, you'll recall that there was significant bushfires around Australia, and this actually contributed to some safety mechanisms in regard to aviation safety. And you might even see from the picture on our slide there of a helicopter and the dust. Dust can be quite a significant issue during drought times in Australia. So if we consider quite a few of the different aspects in our environment before we go flying, think about the weather, thinking about our aerodromes, our airspace. It's one that sometimes that we neglect when we're doing our planning. When was the last time I flew into that airspace? What complexities may be ahead of me when I go to fly into that airspace? Or even what changes have occurred? Terrain. as you'll know that there's quite significant terrain around the eastern seaboard of Australia and parts of Tasmania. Last light. Have I considered when sunset will be, and am I actually capable of flying night VFR? Traffic density. Traffic density is one that often gets dismissed by a lot of pilots or not even considered. Traffic density we need to consider, especially for those of us that may not fly very often or are uncomfortable in significant levels of traffic. When we head off to airports, there might be lots of students in the circuit. There might be large airliners that come in at certain times of the day. And we may need to consider some of these aspects before we actually go flying. So we'll move on to the last one in our PAVE checklist, which is E for external pressures. External pressures can come from multiple areas. So we consider lots of different aspects, one being stress. Stress not necessarily just for the flight that we're undertaking, but our own personal stress that we bring with us from maybe our home environment or our work environment. Passengers. Do I potentially have the pressure of getting my passengers to a destination by a certain time? The culture of our flying community. Deadlines. Expectations that maybe we put on ourselves or that other people put on us to perform. That sense of pride. We've often heard the get there-itis, having no plan B, and we will talk about having a plan B later in our seminar, and obviously timetables. You can find each of these areas covered on our personal minimums checklist that you can order from the CASA online store or is available in the flight planning kit. So planning isn't that hard. Having a plan B, C or D will help you anticipate several things. It can help you anticipate weather changes, whether I may need to divert in flight. Have I catered for that? And that may mean considering all potential landing areas along my flight route. Airspace. So will I actually prevent myself from having airspace infringements or being unfamiliar with the places that I'm actually flying to? And lastly, fuel requirements. Making sure that I actually meet those fuel requirements, not only for the regulations, but to ensure that I have a safe flight. So the question that we need to ask is, why don't some pilots plan? The first one we'll talk about is stress, and we covered stress in that external pressures of our PAVE checklist. So stress may be from conflicting goals. It could be that stress of, I need to get there, so I don't have time, and we'll cover time very shortly. That time portion is maybe self-imposed, or it could be a pressure that someone else is placing on us to get there, whether that be from passengers, maybe even from a financial perspective, that if we're flying for our company, to actually get to a location to conduct our business. Complacency. It's that whole, I can't be bothered, it's a regular flight, I do it all the time, so I don't actually need to do any planning because I do it all the time. Not knowing the rules. Often at many of the seminars we ask pilots whether they're familiar with the new fuel regulations that came in around about 18 months ago. And oftentimes it's not understanding those rules and knowing what their requirements are for actually planning. What has actually changed as far as legislation or regulatory wise that I need to know in order to plan safely for my flight? Electronic flight bags and unauthorised use of GPS. Now these are fantastic pieces of equipment, but unfortunately sometimes they get overused. They give us fantastic situational awareness, but sometimes our over-reliance on technology, especially if it fails in flight, can actually be our undoing. So it's considering what backups do I have if I am relying on my electronic flight bag or my GPS. And no connectivity. That relates back into our last point about electronic flight bags and GPSs. Do I actually have the connectivity to be maintained throughout my flight? So what are the consequences of not planning? We're going to cover 4 case studies here in 4 different areas. Those areas we're going to cover are weather, fuel, weight and balance, and airspace. Now, We're using case studies from both Australia and New Zealand. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau have provided us with a number of examples that we can use here to consider. However, as we go through these case studies, we use these as a learning tool, not to make judgment on those people involved in the actual accident or incident, but more to learn from what occurred, and so that we don't necessarily make those same mistakes in the future. One of the main causes of accidents in Australia is weather-related. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau, or the ATSB, has provided us some data in regard to weather-related incidents. Between 2009 and 2019, there were 101 reported incidents of VFR aircraft in IMC. Now, they estimate approximately 1 in 10 aircraft will result in a fatal accident as a result of VFR aircraft flying into IMC. Now, these accidents can potentially be avoided due to planning on the ground before flight. Our first case study is of a Cessna aircraft based at Southport in 2017. The pilot was hoping to get the aircraft maintained as part of its 100 hourly in Ballina. Now, the pilot was a private pilot, had around about 580 hours, and as I said, the aircraft was coming up due for its 100 hourly. It was due to expire in the next couple of days. In the days leading up to the accident, as part of the attempts, there had been very bad weather around southeast Queensland. And for those of you that have flown around the area of the Gold Coast and northern New South Wales, there's some quite arduous terrain. You may be familiar with a very famous aircraft accident from the 1930s involving a Stinson aircraft that disappeared into the Lamington National Park. And that just demonstrates some of the terrain that can be impacted by weather in the region. On the morning of the accident, it was determined that it was clear weather above Southport. However, it was reported by those in the Ballina region that it was some of the worst weather that they had ever seen. The pilot departed Southport, and after leaving controlled airspace, was seen on radar to start descending into Ballina. Unfortunately, on the day in question, there is no record of the pilot accessing weather information through the NAIPS logon. The pilot was known to be very studious in getting weather information in NOTAMs prior to flying. So whether this information may have been accessed by a different method is unknown. Unfortunately, with the aircraft descending in that arduous terrain, it ended like very many other aircraft accidents in a fatality, around about 13 nautical miles north of Ballina. So what sort of tools do we have available to us in order to help us plan effectively for weather? We have NAIPS, we've talked about NAIPS, so that's our National Aeronautical Information Processing System. We also can get a personal weather briefing from the Bureau of Meteorology using their 1-800 number, and that's 1-800-805-150. In addition, there's cameras at many of our airports around Australia. Now, while I will always put a caveat on using a camera, the cameras sometimes update at slow rates. They can have narrow fields of vision, and therefore you don't get the full aspect of the weather that may be occurring at that particular destination. You've also got the Aerodrome Weather Information Service, or the AWIS, especially at many controlled aerodromes. You've also got the Aerodrome Weather Information Service, or AWIS, at many registered aerodromes. You also have the Aerodrome, or the Automatic Terminal Information Service, the ATIS, at many controlled aerodromes. Other methods that you could use is ringing ahead to the aerodrome. Is there a person there that can actually give you an appraisal of the weather? But just like the cameras, I'll put a caveat on that. Not everyone is an authorised weather observer, and sometimes people have a habit of overestimating cloud base. Electronic flight bags, some of you may have used apps like Windy, or you've got your Mark 1 eyeball. There are many tools available to us in order to plan effectively for weather. So let's move on to our fuel planning case study now. We're going to look at a Cherokee that was due to fly from Portapunka in the Highlands of Victoria across to Parafield in South Australia. The aircraft was due to leave Portapunka, fly via Lilydale pick up some fuel and some passengers, and then fly that direct route up to Parafield, which is more or less the busy GA aerodrome on the outskirts of Adelaide. Now, the aircraft left Portapunka approximately 60 minutes behind their schedule. Upon arriving at Lilydale, the aircraft refueled, picked up their passengers, but then was delayed further. So by the time that they left Lilydale, it ended up being around about 90 minutes behind their schedule. While the pilot was night VFR rated and the aircraft capable of flying at night time, some of these considerations weren't necessarily made. Once airborne out of Lilydale, the pilot actually did have a plan B of getting fuel at Murray Bridge if required. However, Murray Bridge did have its restrictions. Those restrictions were the fact that they didn't have pilot-activated lighting at Murray Bridge. And as you've already heard so far, the aircraft was running approximately 90 minutes behind schedule. Given that the pilot had left in the afternoon, this ended up meaning that the flight was potentially going to go beyond last light. And for those of you that are familiar with the 234 fuel regulation, the pilot's fixed reserve would be 30 minutes for a day VFR flight, but increases to 45 minutes for a night VFR flight. The pilot overflew nil and did assess his fuel status. He calculated he had around about 90 minutes of flight time remaining. He had about 100 litres on board being consumed at the planned rate and based on the weather that he'd experienced along his flight path. As the flight progressed, the headwind became greater than predicted or planned. And additionally, he was required to divert and descend around weather, which increased his fuel consumption and truck miles. So let's have a little bit of a closer look at what happened to the aircraft as they got closer to Adelaide. Unfortunately, night started to descend upon the pilot. And as they started getting closer to the VFR route that would take them into Adelaide and thence onto Parafield, the aircraft had already had to divert around weather and descend, which made picking them up on the radar a little bit harder, and also that additional fuel burn that we talked about. The pilot called up for clearance, but he couldn't actually be identified by air traffic control. And it was some minutes before that they were able to pick him up on the radar. The aircraft was identified about 30 nautical miles south or east of Adelaide and cleared to track via the VFR route. About 6 minutes later, the pilot started to get concerned about their fuel and requested a track to overhead Adelaide. The aircraft was cleared to Adelaide City and then Port Adelaide to head up towards Parafield. However, a minute later, the aircraft ended up declaring a pan due to insufficient fuel, and the aircraft ended up being cleared to land runway 30 at Adelaide. Now, under our current fuel regulations, the requirement would be to declare a mayday if we believe that we're going to eat into our fixed reserve during our flight. And the mayday call would have occurred prior to this particular point. So let's consider some of the main points of this particular flight. The pilot landed successfully, but the post-flight dipstick indications were that there was less than 20 litres remaining in the aircraft. The pilot's last opportunity for fuel was actually at nil because of aerodrome lighting. Even though the aircraft had already had a plan B of Murray Bridge, lighting was not available there. There were other airfields en route, but during daylight hours where fuel could have been made available. The flight was actually conducted at lower altitudes than planned due to cloud, and we saw there that the pilot ended up potentially using more fuel due to descending and having to divert around weather. And had the pilot transmitted a pan call earlier, he may have received a clearance without being identified by air traffic control. So what are some of the tools that we can use to assist us in effectively planning for our flight? One is our Time in the Tanks fuel card, available again on the CASA online store or in the CASA flight planning kit. The other one is our requirements to maintain continuous flight logs throughout our flight at regular intervals. So let's move on to our weight and balance case study. And this one comes to us from New Zealand, involving a Cessna 172, departing a small airfield called Mandeville in the South Island. The aircraft had 4 people on board, pilot and 3 male passengers. The larger of the passengers was sitting in the right front seat, and as you'll see from the picture on the right side of your screen, there was actually quite a large amount of baggage in the baggage hold, approximately 136 kilos, actually overweight for what that area could hold on the aircraft. And prior to flight, the pilot was actually seen bouncing up and down on the back tail of the aircraft, almost to determine weight and balance from that perspective, and stating, "We'll fit another horse in that aircraft." Unfortunately, the aircraft did not clear the trees 500 metres down from the departure threshold of the airfield and ended up clipping the trees and ended up in a fatality with the pilot on board. So what do we need to consider for weight and balance prior to our flight? The first thing that we should always refer to is the aircraft operating manual or the pilot's operating handbook. That should be our first and foremost item that we go to. We also have our flight planning kit, again available on our CASA online store, our VFRG, which is also available online, and passenger briefing cards. Now, the reason I bring up passenger briefing cards is passengers actually understanding their obligations and responsibility before getting on your flight can also assist with weight and balance. I once had a person at one of my seminars state, "No weigh, no go," because we have requirements about when we actually have to weigh our passengers before they get on the aircraft. Additionally, some of the items that we actually put on the aircraft. If our passengers understand what they need to do or what they can and can't bring on our aircraft, that will assist you in conducting not only your weight and balance, but taking away some of those pressures or stresses that we talked about earlier in our seminar. Here's an example of our CASA safety briefing card that you can use. Now, this is available as an A5 card that you can receive from our CASA online store. So the last area that I want to go through in our case studies under pre-flight planning is airspace infringements. Now, the last case study I would like to go through as part of our pre-flight planning is airspace and airspace infringements. There are many causal factors as to why we actually encounter airspace infringements in Australia, and some of this information has come to us courtesy of Air Services Australia. As you'll see from the graph on your screen, pilot distraction, chart misreading, and high workloads can cater for the majority of the reasons why we see airspace infringements. In addition to those, we have pilot inattention and incorrect use of equipment. Now, that use of equipment could be navigation aids, electronic flight bags, GPS. There are many reasons why we may have airspace infringements, but our planning can actually help us prevent those from occurring. Now, this particular graph on our screen talks about where we actually see the majority of our airspace infringements, and commonly it comes from the private pilots. As you'll see on the graph in front of you, the biggest contributor towards airspace infringements is private pilots. But unusually, you'll see above there that commercial pilots are the second highest contributor to airspace infringements in Australia, followed by solo training flights. There has been some data drawn on the experience levels of those pilots that have been involved in airspace infringements. And you'll see from the graph on the right side of our screen, it's not normally our learner pilots or those with low hours that seem to be the main contributor to airspace infringements. It's actually those between 1,000 and 5,000 hours. And from the notes that I have here, the average is around about 3,000 hours for those pilots. So here's a little bit of a small case study for you about an aircraft that was leaving Bowen up in North Queensland, and they were heading down to northern New South Wales. They were initially going to be flying coastal to Shute Harbour, and then it's flying via Bundaberg down the coastline. Now, the pilot was not very familiar with the area. They'd only flown in that region twice in the last 2 years. The pilot was concerned that with low cloud near the coast and that high coastal terrain that we often experience down the eastern seaboard, that they may have needed to actually go a little bit further over water. In an effort to stay out of cloud and away from that high ground along the coast, the pilot decided to track overhead Hamilton Island. And as some of you might see from the map on your screen, Hamilton Island actually has controlled airspace. And it was believed that the pilot, the last time that they'd flown in the area, the airspace wasn't active at the time of their flight. But not having checked ATC hours of activation, the aircraft ended up infringing on Hamilton Island controlled airspace. So how can we prevent airspace infringements from occurring? First of all, we have our maps and our charts. So studying our flight route is extremely important. That also means potentially looking ahead for what clearances we may or may not get from ATC and where we may need to track as a result. Checking NAIPs for our NOTAMs. What airspace is active and deactive? For those of you that aren't aware, not only do we have our normal NOTAMed airspace, but in addition we have temporary restricted airspace that can be activated across Australia. And these NOTAMs, because they don't belong to a particular location, will appear in the head office FIR NOTAMs. So looking through those FIR NOTAMs becomes extremely important to ensure that we don't infringe on airspace that we wouldn't normally expect. Air traffic controllers. Air traffic controllers are a huge source of information in regard to airspace. They would prefer that you actually contact them if you feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable flying through their piece of airspace before you get there. Ring them up on the ground before you go. That way they know who you are when you're actually coming. They can provide you a little bit of information about local procedures that you may not be familiar with. And then last of all, we've got our electronic flight bags, which have a host of information for you, and even with those activations of shading on your screen about when airspace can be active and deactivated. So that covers off on our first component of our pre-flight planning module.